Iran's president says the country is engaged in what he called a full-scale war. Pezeshkian made the statement as fighting with the United States continued across the Gulf region. The US military death toll in the war with Iran rose to 17 after another American service member died in Iraq at the weekend while disposing of unexploded ordnance from a downed Iranian drone. Iran has fired missiles and drones at US military targets across the region. Tehran says it struck bases and other military assets in Kuwait, Jordan and Syria. Air defences were activated in Kuwait and Bahrain. Now, Kuwait and Iran targeted power stations and desalination plants. Meanwhile, the United States has carried out a 9th consecutive night of airstrikes against Iran. US Central Command said it had targeted command centres, air defences, missile and drone sites, coastal surveillance facilities and communications networks. Well, shipping through the Strait of Hormuz has largely halted as Iran has been attacking vessels using routes that it hasn't approved. The United States says its latest strikes targeted the missiles and drone sites used in those attacks. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says other countries should join the effort to protect commercial shipping.
The only reason why the U.S. is conducting strikes is against assets of Iran that are being used to attack global commercial shipping. The Straits of Hormuz are international waterway, and they continue to launch against ships in that international waterway. Other countries should join this effort, but the United States is involved not just in protecting those ships, but in targeting the places that they use to launch these missiles we run.
Sara Bazoobandi is a non-resident fellow at the Institute for Security Policy. That's a German think tank. Welcome back to DW. Marco Rubio says his country's strikes against Iran are limited to protecting commercial shipping. But with attacks spreading across the region, how close is this conflict to escaping the control of both sides?
Thank you for having me. I think we are getting into a situation where there is really difficult to imagine what would be the peaceful, at least in the short, medium term, peaceful outcome of this, because both sides are showing willingness and capacity, for that matter, to escalate. And both sides are still very much insisting on their maximalist demands from their counterparts in any negotiation, future negotiation, if there would be such thing. I think the most important thing to keep in mind in this crisis, in this particular episode, is that both sides are really trying to establish their deterrence in the region, and they are willing to insist, and they are willing to fight back, and that is a very dangerous dynamics for this crisis.
And this is while the 60-day negotiating period is going on. So they're still talking even as there appears to be this escalating military conflict.
Yes, that's true. Talks have continued, perhaps at this moment in time, more through mediators rather than direct talks. But the problem is that this memorandum of understanding from the outset was very unclear. And I think there was a lot of potential for misinterpretation by each side. And Iran has clearly understood that memorandum of understanding in a different way that the United States did. And that has really specifically has to do with the control over Strait of Hormuz. And I think this is the main cause of this episode. But definitely the talks are have started long before this episode, and it is still undergoing. But the question is that, are they going to lead into any conclusion or not?
Can you give us an insight into the thinking of the Gulf states? Because Iran has targeted power stations and desalination plants there. Is that likely to draw Kuwait, Bahrain and others into the war as active participants?
I think the problem that those states are facing is that they have traditionally relied on the United States as their security guarantor. They are not as capable as the Islamic Republic is in military confrontation. They don't have the size, the equipment, the experience that the Islamic Republic has. So in one way or another, they would look back at Washington for a reaction. And I think ultimately the bottom line for all the GCC states is that they do not want this confrontation to escalate any further. They wanted to de-escalate and they wanted to end. And any form of reaction, direct reaction from the GCC, it's going to give even more excuse to the Islamic Republic to attack them. So I would put a less likely chance on the GCC collective reaction to Iran.
And it's interesting how, even though there is this escalation, everybody is trying to keep to limit the escalation. And I wonder if this part of the Iranian strategy is, obviously, it's trying to split the GCC countries, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, as much as it can from the United States, but not so heavily and not hitting them hard enough to provoke a massive overreaction from the US. It's all very finely calibrated.
That's true. I think we have to go back to the old phrase that we kept using at the beginning of this crisis, that each side is escalating to de-escalate. Each side wants to get some form of upper hand over the adversary in order to use that in negotiation to get the conclusion that they want at the negotiation table. So the aim is not to make the adversary extremely angry, but definitely you're right. The divide and rule has been a strategy, and I think Tehran has been very vocal about the division, or at least what is perceived to be division between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, between Israel and the United States, and they are actively trying to create that division between the GCC and the United States. And the ultimate message that Tehran is trying to send is that the United States is not, to the GCC at least, that the United States is not capable of guaranteeing your security anymore. Iran is a very powerful actor, and it's in the interest of everybody to try and comply to a new security structure across the region in which the Islamic Republic is a key powerful player and remains a key powerful player.
Okay, so today we heard from the Yemen-based, Iran-backed Houthi militia that they are now imposing a maritime embargo against Saudi Arabia. The deputy head of the Houthi media office has taken to social media to say that this will affect the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, which separates the Red Sea from the Gulf of Aden. Do you see that as a widening of this conflict or something separate?
I think it's definitely a part of this conflict. The Islamic Republic has heavily relied on proxy group in its regional agenda. Now with Hezbollah extremely weakened, with Syria having seen the end of Bashar al-Assad era, with Iraqi militia groups being limited under or at least the prospect of some sort of limitation under the new government. I think Houthis are the last man standing, so to speak, for the Islamic Republic. And they really are keen on using that card and utilizing the power that they could gain through proxies to just spread the crisis, to create more complication across the region, to show power, to project power, and to re-establish the deterrence, as I mentioned earlier.
So how much domestic pressure are things like the mounting casualties, the economic disruption, the rising energy prices, how much domestic pressure is all of that creating for the US and for Iran?
The level of economic pressure and political pressure, obviously, for Iran is a lot higher than it is in the United States. When I speak to friends and family in Iran, they report that there is daily increase in inflation in Iran. So the country is entering in a very, very critical economic situation. Of course, there is a prospect of bankruptcy of some of the state-owned banks, pension funds. So there is a huge sense of uncertainty across the country. But it doesn't mean that, you know, the economic pressure that the United States is under is not significant. It doesn't, you know, I'm not trying to send that message. But it's a different type of economic pressure. And what also is worth keeping in mind that I always argue that the price on human life in Tehran is completely different than it is in Washington. Thousands of Iranians, thousands of innocent civilians could be lost, could be killed in this crisis, and that would not be considered as a huge pressure for the Islamic Republic. Whereas for the United States, receiving US soldiers in body bags is the red line. So there is this discrepancy that the Iranian state is under more pressure, but able to absorb more economic pressure economically, whereas the United States is probably less able to absorb economic pressure. But when it comes to loss of life, the US is a lot more sensitive than Iran. So for each side, this crisis has different meanings and different type of pressure, but both sides are under increasing level of pressure.
Thank you so much for guiding us through that. Sara Bazoobandi from the Institute for Social Policy.
Thank you.